Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books, where each week we interview an author of a newly published work of nonfiction that we believe is worth your time. The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of the University of Texas Brownsville or this station. And now, here is your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Texas at Brownsville and Texas Southmost College. And with me today is Dr. Richard Sprott, co-author with David Ortman of a book called Sexual Outsiders, Understanding BDSM Sexualities and Communities. I will tell my listeners up front that this material may be objectionable to some viewers, but I hope you will listen anyway because I believe it's a book about valuing diversity. Dr. Sprott, who's with us, has a Ph.D. in research psychology and developmental science, and he's a lecturer in the Department of Human Development and Women's Studies at California State University, East Bay. He's the executive director of Community Academic Consortium for Research on Alternative Sexualities, CARAS, a community academic partnership to enhance and encourage scientific investigation and scholarly analysis of understudied sexualities. He's published in several academic journals and presented papers at community and academic conferences nationwide. Dr. Sprott, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad that you could be here, and I do, as I said up front, say, even though some of this material may be objectionable to some listeners, I do think that this is about valuing diversity. And you talk about, in the introduction, 5 main messages. One is that BDSM is a neutral concept. It's neither good nor bad. Another is that BDSM behavior and practice is grounded in and surrounded by community. Another is there is no one right way of practicing the craft of BDSM. Another is that power is hot. And the final is psychology, religion, and law are just some of the social structures that infuse sexuality with a sense of shame and secrecy. And those are the topics I want us to touch on a little bit, each one. But let's start with the definition of BDSM, which is an acronym that needs a whole lot more letters.
Yes, actually it does. This is a term that's starting to become a little bit more common, both in the community and also among those of us who do research around these communities. BDSM actually stands for bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadism, masochism. So BDSM.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of components in there. Well, why don't we start with what bondage is? That's a good one to start with.
Well, generally, the idea behind bondage is, and even to a certain extent, the discipline part, is when somebody exerts a control over someone else. And generally, this is expressed as a way of tying them up. And people do all sorts of things, use all sorts of materials to restrain or constrict the movement of somebody else. And often many people talk about that the attraction, the draw is that if you are restrained, whether it's with silk scarves or if it's with rope or whether you want to use even something like handcuffs or something, the idea is you have to concentrate on receiving, and you have to concentrate on that expression of giving up a certain amount of control, and that changes one's experience of touch and of sight and sound, and so it changes the experience of an erotic or sexual encounter. Mm-hmm. So lots of people will try some form, right, of tying somebody up, essentially. So that's generally what we mean by bondage. Mm-hmm. The discipline part is much more about the giving commands and obeying commands of doing what somebody else says, and if for some reason you don't, or you don't do it exactly right, then there might be a bit of punishment involved, spanking or something else. Mm-hmm. And that's almost kind of like a psychological expression of that restraint or control.
Dominance?
So those are actually very big elements in the community, although lots of people maybe will focus on some of the other letters. Dominance. Dominance and submission is much more about that control again and giving up an exchange of power. Somebody gets to be the authority and somebody gets to be under that authority. And so the dominance submission part often is expressed as a certain kind of role playing, a certain kind of perhaps relationship that gets set up where somebody is the mistress or the master or the sir or some other role that clearly has a power dynamic, a power difference. And then people will play with that.
You talk about establishing that, and that's one of the most important points in the book is the idea of a contract or an agreement for that state of submission and that state of dominance as to what that's going to entail. Because, of course, there are dysfunctional relationships that are dominant submissive, but what we're talking about here is people willingly going into something that sublimates power in some way, and a power exchange relationship in some way.
Right. And so, in fact, we spent a fair amount of time in a couple of places in the book to talk about the difference between abusive relationships, abusive interactions, abuse, and this dominant submission, this BDSM. And I think of it as that it's one of the reasons why we think that or approach BDSM as sort of a neutral concept. It can be good. It can be used for good. It can enhance certain kinds of relationships and sexual experiences, or it can be used for bad. It can be used in a very destructive, negative way. So we think of it kind of like, fire or electricity. It's something that, if done right, can really add to a person's life, and if not done right, can be really out of control and dangerous. So the communities that have been around for and meeting together and working these kinds of details out for the past 30, 40 years have argued that there's essentially three different things that make BDSM different from abuse. And you mentioned that first one, and it's negotiation. Before you do this, but two people sit down and they really talk it through as to what they want, what they don't want, what are the limits of this, and they essentially agree as to what kind of experience this is going to be, and then to ultimately stick with that. The second part is safe words. It's this idea that during the interaction, during the erotic encounter, there's got to be some sort of signal if something's not quite going right. If something is going wrong, then the person, especially the person who's being the submissive or the one that's being tied up, has to signal that something is going wrong, and that word then means essentially everything stops and we fix the problem, or just everything stops and maybe we'll go back to it later. So safe words are the thing that happen during things. You never know when something might go wrong, not feel right, whatever. And then the last thing is aftercare. Aftercare is what happens after everything's done. Everybody's sort of relaxed and finished, and maybe this is in the few hours afterwards. Maybe it's even the next couple of days. The people check in with each other, right? They see, how are you doing? What's going on? What's coming up? And they provide that kind of care and attention and support for each other.
Yeah, I found it interesting that you had sometimes there was a caregiver who wasn't part of the exchange who comes in to make sure that the care is delivered. I didn't expect that.
Yeah, that's actually one of these strategies that the community has come up with and shared, and they teach newcomers. This is a good way of doing it, especially if you're relatively new, to have someone else know what's going on and be able to come in and provide that care.
So just to be literal about it, occasionally when someone is flogged, there are welts, there are bruises, and the caregiver would put on salve, would nurture the hurt that has been inflicted afterwards. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is. And we also emphasize there's a psychological component, and that is when you're doing some of this sort of what I call extreme sports of sex, sometimes things come up, that feelings or memories or ideas come up that you hadn't really dealt with before. Lots of people use this as ways of exploring themselves and exploring their inner worlds. And so sometimes this stuff comes up, and it can be a little bit disturbing, or you're just not sure what to do with it. And so a part of aftercare is also asking about that, and not just tending to any kind of secondary physical after effects.
Well, I want to touch on the sadomasochism thing a little bit, because your co-author David Ortman is a licensed counselor and social worker, a psychotherapist, a sex therapist, and you're a researcher in psychology. And when we talk about sadism and masochism, we're going to get into clinical definitions and value judgments about things that people do as to whether or not they're part of dysfunctional psychology as opposed to eroticism, and that's an interesting contrast.
Yeah, it is a complicating,
Right.
complicating feature of working in this area. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, does list a number of sexual disorders, which they call the paraphilias. And some of the core ones are sexual sadism and sexual masochism. And the idea is that with these particular conditions, what they're trying to address is, the very real thing that sometimes people are sexual predators. They will attack other people, and they get an erotic charge out of it, and they don't do anything like negotiation or safe words or anything else like that. And so there really is this aspect where they are dangerous to other people and dangerous to themselves. So we do recognize that, but at the same time, often the way the DSM describes these, the way it tries to articulate, well, who is having a mental disorder or a mental dysfunction, can sometimes be misapplied, if not carefully used. And the big thing here generally is the aspect of consent as the big difference between a mental disorder and what some people are doing in their bedrooms that's not necessarily an illness or a disorder.
Yeah. One more time, I want to make a disclaimer to my listeners. This is content that one might find objectionable, but I encourage you to listen because it has to do with valuing diversity. So I encourage you to listen to our interview with Dr. Richard Sprott about sexual outsiders. There's a point where you talk about in BDSM communities that sort of distinguishes this thing you were just talking about. The terms sadism and masochism refer to consensual erotic practices from which a great deal of pleasure and sensation and catharsis can be derived. I mean, that's not what people usually think of first. They think of the abuse and the control and the criminal activities. But we're talking here about something that is consensual, and that leads to eroticism, and that's another point I want you to make, is about the erotic exchange of power that you talk about in the book.
Right. If there's one thing, if you start really looking closely at human sexuality, what you realize is it's all over the place. I mean, people have different sexual experiences and interests and histories and values, and it's a tremendously diverse area of human nature and human experience. And so I guess in some way it's not a surprise that some people might find power, the expression of power, the exertion of power, to be actually kind of erotically interesting, erotically hot.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that some people do find that, when someone carries himself in a very, very confident, dominant sort of way, that's actually sexually attractive, or that somebody who gives themselves over and acts submissive actually might be sexually attractive. We kind of maintain that this is not true for all aspects of BDSM or all people involved in leather, kink, fetish, BDSM communities, but many of them really are attracted to this whole area because they find power to be erotic.
Mm-hmm.
And so they try to figure out all these different ways of playing with it, of incorporating it into their sexual encounters.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about the various words that are represented by BDSM, but we probably ought to talk briefly about what kink and fetish mean in terms of sexuality in the book as you look at it.
Well, kink is the term that actually comes from the communities.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a term that's used by psychiatrists or psychologists or doctors. So it's not medical language. It's a language actually from the communities themselves. When they first started really organizing and communicating with each other around these sexual interests, we have a couple of scholars who have looked at the history of this and find that a lot of it started happening in essentially the 1930s and 40s. And the words they used there were generally kink. Are you kinky?
Mm-hmm.
And so the word generally means anything that's not mainstream sexuality.
Right.
Then the fetish part is also is something where somebody is attracted to a particular type of material or object that they find erotic. That's generally not the main. Let's say the main ingredients of your standard typical sexual encounter.
Well, let me ask you about one, since it's mentioned in the book, and I'm not sure that it's defined for those of us that don't know what it is, and that was bootblacking?
Oh, bootblacking, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, actually, let's see. There are people who get an erotic charge out of, or who are very interested in providing some sort of service to somebody else. Again, it's that kind of power exchange or that kind of interaction where if you have boots, they get scuffed, they get marked up, they get, they dry out, and leather needs constant care.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're boot blacking, what you're doing is you're reconditioning, and you are repairing, and you are polishing the boots so that they look at their best condition.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually a fairly, there are in certain circles actually contests where people compete as to how good they are at this particular skill of taking care of boots. Mm-hmm. And then some people incorporate that into their relationships or into their sexual encounters.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch on some of the therapeutic conversations because they're really interesting. But one of the things that came up for me as I was reading this is I noticed that proportionately the people in the BDSM community were more likely to have, it seems to me, in terms of the percentages, an alternate gender preference as part of it. Is that a fair statement that the alternate gender preference people are more likely to get into sexual outsider activities, BDSM activities?
That's actually a pretty good question, and I don't know if we really have a good answer to that. I mean, we've done in CARIS, we've done a couple of studies where we get about, internet studies with about 1,000, 1,500 respondents. And generally I'd say the largest percentage of the, I guess you could say, kinky community is heterosexual. Mm-hmm. Okay. But there is this very interesting dynamic where other sexual minorities, lesbian, gay, transgender people are sort of like very commonly into this as well. So that you can get high numbers. And that generally I think it's because when people are interested in this kind of area, mm-hmm. they're open to quite a lot of different things when it comes to sexuality. Very good. And so a lot of people find themselves comfortable in these areas.
Yeah, I remember one guy declaring himself heteroflexible. But that sort of brings up a question for me because you really relate this to coming out. And this is the big deal to me about accepting diversity, is when someone comes out that they are into BDSM, it's the same as when they come out that they're gay with their family. It's not widely accepted. Your last section of the book is a very good title. It is that sexual freedom is not PC, not politically correct. And I think that's the issue that a lot of these folks face and are dealing with, and that's why they have to go to therapy in some cases.
Absolutely. If they are feeling that kind of rejection or stigma because nobody understands their sexuality, or people find it somehow in some way disgusting, mm-hmm. Then that really puts them under a lot of stress and a lot of isolation. And so it's not surprising that they may look for or need some sort of therapy or counseling. Mm-hmm. And it is, I think, pretty similar. One of the things that the mm-hmm. coming out aspect. Mm-hmm. One aspect of it, when we talk with sexual minorities who are also into BDSM, whether they're gay men or bisexual women or what we tend to find is that since they've already had a coming out around a different aspect of their sexuality, mm-hmm. they find coming out as being into BDSM or into kinky sex much easier. Right. But heterosexuals who haven't had to come out about anything often find it much more difficult and challenging, and they wrestle a lot more with, what's the impact going to be if my family finds out, or if I tell people? How's that going to affect my family, my job? How's that going to change my friendships? And so they are often dealing with the exact issues that somebody who's just discovering same-sex attraction kind of go through. Mm-hmm. So I think that the process is very similar. It's that difficulty of admitting or owning up to or being exposed as somebody who's doing some sort of sexuality that's not understood or not approved or somehow in some way is stigmatized.
Again, sexual freedom is not politically correct. Now, there's a couple of therapeutic examples that I find really interesting, and I want to talk about communities of support as well. But the poor guy who he and his wife were trying to get something going, and when she spanked him, there were problems because as a teenager, his mother had abused him physically. And so he had to get over that in order to be sexually liberated with the woman who wants to spank him and make that part of their experience.
Yes. That's our big case in Chapter 4, where we really go through that some people into BDSM or kinky sex can sometimes use it to heal from past abuse. Mm-hmm. And that I think that this is, we don't know how common an experience it is or how many people do it like this, but it certainly does happen. So we really go through and look carefully at what goes into making, what really allows this to be used for healing or for overcoming these sort of past bad experiences.
And that's very interesting because I don't know how many people would think of human sexuality as an avenue for catharsis and release of psychological pain, and yet it seemed to work there.
It does, and I think that the key thing we try to get across is, first off, they were very intentional about both working up to the scene, the sexual encounter, and we're very, very good about debriefing it and reflecting on it and really exploring it after.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because the when the wife was present, he seemed to open up more to the therapist than when she wasn't, and she actually did some of the talking for him, and it was okay.
Yes, and I think that again points to the importance of that kind of emotional and social support, especially when you're trying to deal with past trauma.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to touch on the communities that support BDSM a little bit. There are those who do, and that becomes part of the drama, I guess.
Yes, there are to a certain extent, large community organizations. There are many, many, many smaller ones of groups, and they tend to come together to not just to socialize, but also to educate each other about the best ways of doing BDSM, the safe ways of doing BDSM. And so there are, I think at one point a number of years ago, we sat down and counted. We got up to roughly about 1,000 different community groups that we could locate in Canada and the U.S., and many of them are small, like 20 people. Some of them are large, like 600, 700, 800 people. And then there are major community events where, it's like a convention. It's like or a street fair where there are events where people come together. So there's quite a lot of, there is actually quite a lot of community.
In 30 seconds or less, I want to touch on something that I think deals with the whole issue of valuing diversity. You talk about those events, and there was one outdoor BDSM event that you talked about where there was a dominant and a submissive, and the dominant had the submissive tow him around in a rickshaw, and he hit him with a buggy whip. Unfortunately, the dominant was white and the submissive was black. You talk for a moment about that, accepting that?
Well, that we raised that as, this was very controversial, even within the community, because of concerns around racism. And are we just recreating a racist trauma when we play with that? Or are we using it for some sort of healing? Or are we really valuing sexual freedom if we allow people to explore and to play the way they want to, even if it offends us or we think that somehow in some way it's wrong because of concerns around racism, and this can extend over to sexism and all sorts of painful things in our society. So sort of raise it as a question of what's going on here and how important it is to still create enough space to respect other people's sexual expressions and their explorations, and even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Very nice. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We've been talking with Dr. Richard Sprott about the book by David Ortman and Richard A. Sprott, Sexual Outsiders, Understanding BDSM Sexualities and Communities. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Remember that if you don't hear our program in the 4 times it airs during the week, you can also go to Facebook to our page, Good Books Radio, and hear the interviews there. Thanks for listening.